When both you and a narcissist stop reaching out, something profound begins to happen beneath the surface, and it's rarely talked about honestly. At first glance, it may look like mutual detachment, even maturity, two people walking away. But psychologically, this moment is anything but neutral. For a narcissist, silence is not peace. Silence is threat. Narcissistic attraction and attachment are built less on connection and more on control, validation, and narrative dominance. As long as contact continues, texts, arguments, emotional check-ins, the narcissist remains psychologically fed. Even conflict reassures them that they still matter, that they still occupy space in your emotional world. But when communication stops on both sides, something destabilizing occurs. The familiar feedback loop disappears, and with it, their sense of orientation. What's important to understand is that narcissists don't experience silence the way emotionally grounded people do. For a healthy individual, silence can mean reflection, healing, or simply acceptance. For a narcissist, silence feels like erasure. Not being contacted doesn't register as they're taking space. It registers as I'm no longer being mirrored. And without that mirror, the narcissist is left alone with something they spend their entire lives avoiding, an unstable sense of self. In the early phase of mutual silence, the narcissist often feels a strange calm. They may even tell themselves they've won. They might posture outwardly, act indifferent, appear unbothered. But internally, a quiet anxiety begins to build, because control, once lost, becomes an obsession. The absence of your attention creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is intolerable for someone whose identity depends on predictability and dominance. This is the moment where the power dynamic subtly shifts, not because you're playing a game, but because you're no longer participating in one. When you stop reacting, explaining, defending, or chasing closure, you remove yourself from the narcissist's psychological stage. And without an audience, their performance collapses. Philosophically, this moment exposes a deep truth about attraction and attachment. Real connection deepens in silence. Narcissistic connection decays in it. Where emotional intimacy can survive space, ego-based attachment cannot. Silence doesn't starve love, it starves control. As days pass, the narcissist begins to rewrite the story in their mind. Why haven't they reached out? Becomes, what does it mean that they haven't reached out? And eventually, what if I no longer matter? This is where panic quietly enters, not always visibly. Sometimes it shows up as sudden curiosity, covert monitoring, indirect attempts to reinsert themselves, liking an old post, asking about you through others, creating moments designed to be noticed. And here's the most important distinction. When both of you stop contacting, you are reclaiming your autonomy. When the narcissist stops contacting, they are waiting for you to break first, waiting for confirmation that the bond still exists on their terms. Your continued silence doesn't provoke them because it's cruel. It provokes them because it's free. This is why this phase is so powerful for you, not as a tactic, but as a turning point. It forces clarity. You begin to see how much of the relationship was sustained by your emotional labor, and they begin to feel how little remains when that labor is withdrawn. So if you find yourself in this space, where neither of you is reaching out, understand this: silence is not emptiness. It is information. And the way someone responds to your absence tells you far more than how they behaved in your presence. When both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, something psychologically fascinating begins to unfold, and it's rarely what people expect. On the surface, it may look like mutual detachment, like two people quietly moving on, but beneath that calm exterior, very different internal processes are taking place. For you, silence often becomes a space for clarity. For the narcissist, silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors are deeply uncomfortable for someone who survives on reflection rather than substance. A narcissist doesn't experience connection the same way a healthy person does. Their sense of self is externally regulated, meaning they rely on attention, reaction, and validation from others to feel real, stable, and in control. When communication stops on both sides, the narcissist loses a key source of emotional regulation. There's no reassurance of influence, no confirmation that they still matter in your world. And that absence doesn't feel neutral to them. It feels like a threat. At first, they may interpret the silence as temporary. Narcissists are accustomed to people coming back, explaining themselves, apologizing, or seeking closure. They often believe they occupy a permanent position in others' minds. So the initial phase is denial. They assume you're thinking about them, missing them, waiting. In their mind, the bond still exists because they haven't yet accepted that attention has truly been withdrawn. But as time passes and the silence holds, something shifts. Without contact, they lose access to the emotional feedback loop that once reassured them of their importance. This is where discomfort turns into anxiety. The narcissist begins to feel a loss of control, not because they miss you in a deeply emotional way, but because they can know. Longer locate themselves through your reactions. Silence strips away the illusion that they are unforgettable, irreplaceable, or central. This is also the point where your silence becomes powerful, even unintentionally. When you don't reach out, explain, or react, you stop feeding the dynamic that kept the relationship alive. You're no longer playing a role in their inner narrative. And for someone who depends on others to confirm their identity, being excluded from that narrative feels destabilizing. Meanwhile, on your side, something different is happening. Without constant emotional noise, your nervous system begins to settle. You start noticing patterns more clearly, how much energy you gave, how often you adjusted yourself, how rarely your needs were met. Silence gives you perspective, and perspective weakens emotional attachment. This is why mutual no contact is rarely equal. One person gains clarity, the other loses leverage. Eventually, the narcissist is forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that they may not have the impact they believe they had, that your life may be moving forward without reference to them. And that realization can provoke a range of responses, from sudden outreach to indirect attempts to get your attention, to rewriting the story in their mind to protect their ego. The crucial thing to understand is this: your silence is not a tactic, it's a boundary. And boundaries don't provoke healthy reflection in narcissists, they expose fragility. When you stop contacting them and they stop contacting you, the illusion of control collapses. What remains is truth. And here's the reflection to hold on to. The moment you stop chasing understanding from someone who never sought to understand you, you begin reclaiming your power. Silence doesn't end the story. It reveals who was really writing it when both you and a narcissist stop contacting each other. Something deceptively quiet happens on the surface, but psychologically, it's anything but quiet. This is the moment where power dynamics are exposed. For a narcissist, silence isn't neutral. It's not just the absence of communication, it's the sudden loss of a mirror. Narcissists regulate their sense of self through external validation. Attention, reactions, emotional engagement. These are the things that stabilize their inner world. When that stops, especially without drama or explanation, it creates a kind of internal static they don't know how to sit with. At first, they may appear unaffected. This is important to understand. Narcissists are highly invested in the image of being unbothered. Silence from you doesn't immediately produce panic, it produces calculation. They replay interactions not to reflect emotionally, but to assess status. Did I win? Do I still have access? Am I still important in their mind? What unsettles them isn't missing you in the way a secure person might. It's the uncertainty of whether they still matter. Meanwhile, something very different is happening on your side, even if you're not fully aware of it yet. When contact stops, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. The constant push-pull, the emotional highs and lows, the subtle invalidations, all of that starts to lose its grip. And as your emotional availability withdraws, the narcissist's sense of control weakens. This is where the imbalance begins to flip. The narcissist thrives on reaction. Positive or negative doesn't matter as much as consistency. When both of you stop reaching out, they're deprived of feedback. No praise, no anger, no reassurance, no proof of relevance. That absence forces them to confront something they avoid at all costs: emotional emptiness. Not loneliness in the romantic sense, but a hollow space where validation used to be. This is often when you'll notice a shift, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic. They may test the waters with something low effort, a like, a vague message, a hey, just checking in, not because they've suddenly gained clarity or empathy, but because silence has disrupted their internal hierarchy. They need to know if they can still elicit a response. Your response, or lack of one, becomes data. Philosophically, this moment reveals a deeper truth about attraction and power. Real connection grows through mutual presence and vulnerability. Control-based connection survives on imbalance. When you stop participating in that imbalance, even quietly, the system destabilizes. And here's the key point most people miss. You don't need to explain your silence for it to be effective. Silence speaks fluently to those who are attuned to power. What happens next depends less on the narcissist and more on you. If silence becomes a boundary rather than a tactic, something profound occurs. You stop measuring your worth through their attention. You stop waiting. You stop orienting your emotional compass around someone who was never emotionally available in the first place. And that internal shift is often what finally breaks the hold they had over you. Because the truth is, when both of you stop contacting each other, the narcissist isn't facing your absence. They're facing their loss of influence. And the moment you realize that your silence isn't punishment, but self-respect, is the moment you stop being part of the cycle and start reclaiming your power. When both you and the narcissist stop contacting each other, something very revealing begins to happen beneath the surface. On the outside, it may look like nothing: silence, distance, a void where constant interaction once lived. But psychologically, this is one of the most destabilizing moments for a narcissist, and one of the most clarifying moments for you. A narcissist is driven less by connection and more by control. Contact, attention, reaction, these are their emotional oxygen. When communication stops from both sides, the narcissist loses a familiar feedback loop. There is no reassurance of influence, no validation through response, no confirmation that they still occupy space in your mind. This absence creates an internal tension because narcissists are deeply dependent on external signals to regulate their sense of self. Without those signals, they are forced into a confrontation they actively avoid: uncertainty. What's important to understand here is that silence from you does not register to a narcissist as peaceful closure. It registers as ambiguity, and ambiguity is threatening. When they don't know whether you miss them, resent them, have moved on, or no longer care at all, their imagined dominance begins to erode. They may replay past conversations, search for meaning in old interactions, or subtly check your social presence. Not because they suddenly value intimacy, but because they are trying to re-establish a sense of psychological position. At the same time, this shared silence shifts your internal landscape. When the constant push and pull ends, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. You start noticing how much energy was spent anticipating their moods, decoding their behavior, or managing emotional volatility. In the absence of noise, clarity emerges. This is often when people realize that what felt like passion was actually anxiety, and what felt like connection was often conditional approval. Here's the paradox: while you grow steadier in silence, the narcissist often becomes more internally agitated. They're used to being the one who withdraws and reappears on their terms. Mutual silence removes that asymmetry. It signals, whether intentionally or not, that they no longer are control the rhythm. And for someone whose identity is built around influence, that loss of narrative control is deeply unsettling. This is why, after a period of no contact from both sides, narcissists often re-emerge in subtle ways: a casual message, a reaction to a post, a checking in. These are not always expressions of missing you. They are attempts to see if the door is still unlocked. If you respond emotionally, the dynamic resets. If you don't, the silence becomes definitive, and that is where their panic peaks. But the most critical shift happens within you. When neither of you reaches out, you are no longer playing defense or offense. You're observing. You're no longer reacting. You're choosing. Silence stops being a tactic and becomes a boundary. And boundaries are something narcissists fundamentally struggle to tolerate, because boundaries don't negotiate. So if you find yourself in this mutual quiet, don't rush to fill it. Notice who grows in it and who unravels. Because silence doesn't end the story, it reveals who needed control more than connection and who finally learned the power of letting go. When both you and a narcissist stop contacting each other, something very specific begins to unfold beneath the surface, something most people misunderstand. From the outside, it can look like mutual indifference, like two people simply moving on. But psychologically, this is rarely what's happening, especially for a narcissist. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a threat. A narcissist's sense of self is not internally stable. It relies heavily on external validation, attention, reactions, reassurance that they still matter. Contact, even conflict, feeds that system. When communication stops entirely, what disappears isn't just a person but a mirror. And without that mirror, the narcissist is forced into a confrontation with emptiness they've spent their entire life avoiding. At first, there is often a strange calm. You may notice that the silence feels oddly peaceful on your side, while on theirs it can look like confidence or pride. But internally, this calm is not resolution, it's suppression. The narcissist tells themselves a story: I don't need them. They were lucky to have me. I'm in control. This narrative is essential because it protects their ego from the more uncomfortable truth that they've lost access to someone who once reflected their importance back to them. As time passes, however, that story begins to crack. The absence becomes harder to ignore. There's no message coming in, no reaction to provoke, no emotional response to regulate their sense of power. And this is where the psychological tension escalates. The narcissist doesn't miss you in the way a secure person misses someone. They miss the role you played in stabilizing their identity. They miss the reassurance that they were desired, influential, significant. What's important here is that your silence forces a loss of control. For someone who thrives on managing perception and emotional outcomes, not knowing what you're thinking or feeling is deeply unsettling. Are you hurting? Have you moved on? Do you no longer care? Each unanswered question chips away at their sense of dominance. This is often the stage where impulsive behaviors emerge: checking your social media, asking mutual contacts about you, or rehearsing messages they never send. In some cases, this is where hoovering begins: a sudden message, a vague apology, a nostalgic memory, or even manufactured concern. Not because they've had a profound emotional awakening, but because silence has destabilized them enough to seek relief. For you, this phase is critical. Your silence is no longer just absence, it's a boundary. And boundaries are profoundly revealing. They expose who respects autonomy and who only respects access. If contact resumes, it often does so in a way that tests whether the old dynamic still exists. Will you respond quickly? Will you explain yourself? Will you re-enter the emotional dance? The real shift happens if you don't. When silence remains intact, something irreversible can occur. The narcissist is forced to redirect their attention elsewhere, not because they've healed, but because the supply has dried up. And for you, the longer you remain grounded in your own life, the clearer it becomes that peace was never found in managing their emotions. It was found in stepping away from them. Silence in this context is not punishment. It's clarity. It reveals who needed control and who needed connection. And once you see that difference, you're no longer tempted to confuse attention with love. The moment you stop chasing closure from someone who could never give it, you reclaim something far more valuable, your emotional authority. When we talk about the final shift that happens in this dynamic, we're really talking about where the power ultimately lands. And here's the part most people don't expect. The real transformation doesn't happen inside the narcissist at all. It happens inside you. By the time you reach this stage, you've already stopped chasing clarity from someone who thrives on ambiguity. You've stopped interpreting every silence as a puzzle you must solve. What changes now is not their behavior, but your relationship with yourself. And that's why this moment is so destabilizing for a narcissist, because narcissistic control depends on one thing above all else: your emotional availability to their chaos. A narcissist is regulated by attention, positive attention, negative attention, confusion, longing, it all works, but indifference does not. When you no longer react, explain, defend, or seek validation, you step out of the psychological contract they believed you had signed. And in that moment, something profound happens. You stop being a mirror for their ego and start becoming a grounded presence in your own life. This is where many people get it wrong. They think healing looks like finally Bane. G understood by the narcissist finally getting closure, finally hearing an apology. But closure isn't something a narcissist gives, it's something you claim. It's the quiet decision that says, I no longer need you to see my worth in order for it to be real. Philosophically, this is a shift from external validation to internal authority. You stop outsourcing your sense of value. Psychologically, it's the moment your nervous system learns safety without drama. That's why it feels unfamiliar at first. Peace can feel boring when your body has been trained to equate intensity with connection. But peace is not absence, it's stability. And here's the paradox: the more whole you become, the less power the narcissist has, and the more visible that loss of power becomes to them, not because you announce it, but because you embody it. You don't over-explain, you don't linger, you don't try to prove anything. Your boundaries become quiet, firm, and non-negotiable. At this stage, you may notice something interesting. Their attempts to re-engage feel smaller, less convincing, almost hollow. That's because manipulation only works when it has an emotional hook. When the hook is gone, the behavior collapses under its own weight. What replaces the chaos is discernment. You start noticing how someone greets you, not just with their words, but with their consistency. You value how you feel after interactions, not just during them. You begin choosing relationships that don't require you to abandon yourself to be loved. And this is the real win. Not that the narcissist panics, not that they notice your absence, but that you no longer need them to. Because the moment you stop trying to be chosen by someone who cannot truly choose you, you choose yourself. And that choice changes everything. So let this be the thought you carry forward. The most powerful response is not silence used as strategy, but silence born of self-respect. When you no longer seek meaning from those who thrive on confusion, you reclaim the one thing that was always yours, your sense of self.